I don't know if any of you know the history of disability, but it's a very dark one. The first use of the word idiot that was ever been found that we've been able to trace was in 1500 BC, 3,500 years ago, in relation to an intellectual impairment. That's a long time, because you've probably heard that in the last few weeks, haven't you? That word being used. When we look at the ancient Greeks, in Sparta, if you had a child with a disability, that child had to be put to death by law. In Roman times, the children with disability were mutilated and thrown into the Tiber River. Even if we move forward in time, even through some of the churches, for example, Luther said that people with disability were changelings. The devil sits where the soul should be, and they should be drowned at birth. So it sort of gives you an idea that we're talking about thousands and thousands of years of devaluation of a particular group of people. And what we're talking about is really only in the last 20 years that in Australia we're really starting to talk about ordinary life for people with disability. So when compared to 3,500 years, we're talking about a very small window of opportunity that's in front of us now, but it's a window that we've actually got to grasp. Later, particularly in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a major move towards segregation and sterilisation. And this was very much in relation to people with disabilities seen as breeding and being a genetic threat. In other words, they were actually going to destroy the gene pool of the population. They would soon outbreed the people. And associated with this, and when I first started doing psychology, was a whole range of low expectations. For example, I was taught that if a person had an IQ below 50, they were ineducable. And if they had an IQ below 30, they were untrainable. So realistically, why would you actually ever think of putting a child into school if they're ineducable? And that was the actual law. In most states of Australia, that up to 1976 in Western Australia, for example, children with a significant intellectual disability were not allowed to go to school by law. They were actually barred under the Education Act. Maybe many of you have been taught about having a maximum potential. Now, I don't know if anyone else in the society has reached the maximum potential, but kids with disabilities seem to have it. In other words, there's this belief that they go along to a certain point and they plateau, whereas every other kid is just expected to increase and go on for life. So these are expectations which are built into our society, and some of them goes back to the beginnings of IQ testing. For example, the first IQ test that's really talked about is a guy called Galton, who was a nephew of Charles Darwin, and what he believed was that the amount that you actually could feel pain and heat and cold was a measure of intelligence. So in other words, if you didn't react to pain or didn't react to heat and cold, that was an indication that you weren't very intelligent. That actually caused institutions not to be hit for many years, which is quite a serious thing when you think about the implications of that. He also believed that we need an IQ test to find those people who should breed and who shouldn't breed. The history of that also then went into a guy called Binet, who developed a series of puzzles. Well, this guy Binet, together with a man called Simon, devised an IQ test which was designed to find those children who were slipping behind at school so they could get additional help in order to assist them to become regular members of the public. However, there's a guy called Terman. Now, when you hear of the Stanford Binet, Terman was from Stanford University, and this is what Stanford University, or the Terman, came across in terms of why he wanted to use the IQ test. As a result of that, the whole policy of the United States government changed dramatically. There was eugenic society set up right through America and Australia in the 20s, designed to stop the breeding of various classes of people. So what we've got now, and this is the reality that I think you need to think about, is what is an IQ test used for? And an IQ test is almost always used to segregate and separate, is it not? Some of the assumptions. IQ is stable throughout life. In other words, we test your IQ any time after 5 years, and that's your lot. That's where you're going to actually stay. The second one is it cannot be increased significantly. Testing situation is not a major issue. Now just think of the logic of this. I can come to your child as a qualified psychologist, spend an hour with your child, and be able to predict your child's future better than you who've known the child intimately for the whole of that child's life. How stupid is that? Child will be motivated to try their best. Now let's just think about that. You're in there with a total stranger in an unlikely situation, and you're going to try your best when, particularly if you haven't got language, etc. Realistically, it's just not going to happen, is it? Now, what would happen if you failed at everything through your life? What would it do to your motivation? And the obvious thing is that you would give up trying, wouldn't you? And this is a very common thing that many of you may have found, is you say, oh, let's come try and do something, and the child says, don't want to, I want to know about it, etc. So in an IQ test situation, what are you going to get? Now, the only way you can get out of an IQ test is to fail. Other things, the result is valid. In other words, it's a valid predictor of the future. It's reliable. If we test you today and test you tomorrow, you'll come up with the same result. And the other thing is that IQs won't change expectations. In other words, if I tell you that your son has got an IQ of 20, that won't affect you. Well, there's a guy called Rosenthal who was very heavily criticised for a study he did. He went into a school and he asked the teacher if he could test the kids, and he tested all the kids, and he told the teacher what he'd given them was a spurt test. This was a test which would pick late bloomers, and told the teacher the name of the children who he thought were going to spurt ahead. He came back a few months later, and what do you reckon happened? Well, we all know the answer, don't we? Those kids spurted ahead. He'd actually picked the kids at random, and the test he used was an intelligence test. So those kids actually scored higher on the intelligence test than the second score purely because of the teacher's expectations. What's some alternative set of assumptions? IQ scores can be changed through intervention. That goes back to the late 1960s, where we've actually seen data to actually show that you can change a child's IQ by intervention. Expectations. Now, if I told you that I'd found a man who had 3% of the cerebral cortex, that's the thinking areas of your brain, what would you say he would be capable of? Well, most of us would say he's not very capable very much. But that was an actual instance reported in the press a couple of years ago, where he had a first-class honours degree in mathematics from Oxford University. The other thing is kids with disabilities can learn faster than normal. What I'm arguing is that, in fact, you can actually teach kids faster than normal so they can get a catch-up. Now, this isn't going to happen with every child under every situation. What I'm trying to get to is that this is possible. If you don't believe it's possible, it will never happen. But if you believe it's possible, it can happen. So let's look at who's the most powerful teacher here. Well, actually it's parents, isn't it? You learn more in the first 5 years of life than any other time in your life. Who's the teacher? You actually have more time available than anyone else. That's around about 5,000 hours per year you have in the first 5 years of life for interactions which could be teaching interactions. You actually know how to teach really well. For example, if you're trying to teach a child to catch a ball, what do? We start with a beach ball, you hold his arms out, you roll it into his hand. Clever boy! You all know this stuff, don't you? You know, and then you move a little further away and you get smaller balls and so forth. And the key thing that they've got is they love the student, which is such a powerful thing in terms of actually knowing about teaching. So what do we know about learning? In terms of what the research says about how to actually learn fast, it depends on the amount of time actively engaged, including, and that's a subset of this, is a fast pace. Material linked to the student's level, so it's actually the careful matching of the situation that's reinforcing and it's relevant to the student's world. The first thing to do is build a vision. If you've got a vision, then you've got an actual chance of actually doing something here. If you haven't got a vision, well, we have a vision already organised for you, haven't we, in terms of services. And I don't suspect there's anyone in this room who really wants that decision in their heart of hearts. Think about continual learning and development all through life. There's no such thing as a plateau. But it's not straightforward, is it? Don't accept someone saying maximum potential. It's a load of nonsense. No one's got a maximum potential. You're just going to keep on learning for the rest of your life. It's better to set a high expectation and fail to meet it than to set and meet a low expectation. And if you just keep on with that, just believe in yourself as a great teacher, because you are. You're the best teacher in your child's life. And the other thing is to realise that you know that child, you're the absolute expert on your child, and you've got to take a senior partner role in decisions.